The Australian Pavilion this afternoon and for a really exciting session looking at the impacts of climate change on childhood, on children, and some of the things that we can do to really have an impact and reduce the effects of climate change on children. It's a really important topic, but we know that it's often one that is under-considered. Children represent a third of the global population and half of those living in extreme poverty. And we know that these circumstances significantly heighten their vulnerability. But as climate change accelerates, they're disproportionately impacted due to unique developmental characteristics and also reliance on adults for protection and support. We know that climate change is not only threatening the immediate survival and well-being of children, but also the futures that they can build for themselves. And so it's absolutely essential that we address their needs through targeted strategic interventions. But what has been missing from the policy making and from the finance landscape is child-centred risk analysis, which can lead to informed, targeted investments in interventions to improve the resilience of children and their families. So today that's exactly what we're going to talk about, what work is being done to improve the understanding of climate impacts for children and how this can inform effective and impactful investments with long-term benefits. Should have introduced myself. My name's Alice. I'm from UNICEF Australia, and I'm really delighted to be here with this wonderful panel today. I'll introduce each of them briefly, and then we'll go into discussion. So Sylvia Gaia is the Chief of Climate Partnerships for UNICEF globally. She was previously the Regional Advisor for Climate, Sustainable Environment and WASH in East Asia Pacific, working closely across our region to lead the design of multi-sectoral climate-smart programming for children in some very, very diverse contexts. Lincoln Ingravel is a UNICEF Australia Young Ambassador. He works in Australia's energy sector. Grew up in Gippsland, which many of you may know is a coal-powered community that's been deeply impacted by the Black Summer bushfires, but is now also experiencing the clean energy transition and impacted by that. Dr. Siobhan McDonnell is an Associate Professor at the Crawford School of Public Policy at ANU. She's a lawyer and anthropologist with many years of experience working with Indigenous people in Australia and the Pacific. And she's been a lead negotiator on climate change for a range of Pacific governments, including launching the Loss and Damage Fund on behalf of Fiji and the Pacific in 2021, and now leading a lot of work on mitigation. And finally, but definitely not least, is Jenny Chand, who's part of the climate finance team at the Fiji Ministry of Environment and Climate Change. Jenny looks at how climate finance can effectively reach communities in ways that can be most impactful and effective, and is here really focusing on those negotiations around long-term finance. So to kick us off, I want to turn to Sylvia and ask, why is it so important that we have a clear picture of the risks that children face from climate change? And what have we learned so far about how these risks are distinct from those that adults face?
Hi, I am not sure you can hear us with all this rain noise, but first of all, let me just thank you to UNICEF and Australia government to organize this session, because it's very important that we find the space to discuss about how climate change affects in general the world, the society, the ecosystems, but particularly children, because it's a very underrepresented group, but yet very much affected. We have been experiencing climate for years now, but we see that there is an intensity that is growing in terms of the intensity of the shocks and also the number of hazards. And on the top of that, we are seeing also how the hazards hits community for several times in a row, right? What we call the overlapping of hazards in communities and for children. That is basically, in regions like yours, East Asia and Pacific, is one of the major drivers of inequality, because the children that are not prepared to be able to cope, not only with one, but with two and with three and with four and more shocks in a given period is really complicated. So UNICEF is really trying to understand how the impacts of climate change affects children uniquely. They are not the only one affected, but it's a very particular and very vulnerable group that requires special attention. And that's why UNICEF is really working on data that we will be discussing later, and on programs that really look at the particular effects of climate change on children and how to protect them and accompany them and help them, not only them, but also their families, their communities, to really thrive and be much more resilient and adapted to the effects of climate change. So in that regard, it's very important to be here and to be able to bring the voice of those that don't have a lot of voice. So thank you.
Thank you, Sylvia. And I think the effective multiple compounding disasters is really an important one to consider. And I read this morning that the super typhoon that just hit Philippines recently was the 21st typhoon to hit the Philippines this year alone. So if you can imagine the compounding impacts of that, particularly for children who have their schooling disrupted, who have access to health services disrupted, and what that can do in terms of for every day a child is out of school, it becomes more and more likely that they will never return to school. And so this is where we need to make sure that those services are able to resume as quickly as possible, can withstand the impacts of these shocks. To turn to Siobhan, we know that children are one of the groups especially vulnerable to both economic and non-economic losses from climate change, such as displacement, disruption to education. Given the complexity of climate finance system, what practical steps can negotiators and policymakers take to ensure these needs are explicitly addressed in some of the mechanisms we're talking about this week, like loss and damage?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, and thank you for the invitation to participate, and thanks to the audience for coming and bearing with us in slightly difficult circumstances. We, as negotiators, have been building the Loss and Damage Fund over a number of years, and that's been a call from the Pacific, from AOSIS, from DCs, from G77 in China, from the global south countries, really, from climate countries in particular. And it's really been a call to respond to the climate impacts that cannot be addressed through adaptation. So loss and damage is really about thinking through the fact that climate impacts increasingly are causing a scale of impact that cannot be addressed through adaptation measures. And what we see increasingly in my work in, particularly in the areas of relocation, is that when you look at vulnerable populations, you can see these cumulative impacts that are occurring. So if I look at a relocation that I've been working on over a number of years, and I look at children as a population in particular, what you see is displaced people moved in Vanuatu from one island, Ambai Island, to another island of Santo, who have now had interrupted education experiences over 4 and 5 years. So that's one disaster, one set of relocations, and one set of education, health, housing related impacts on that population. Okay. We, in Vanuatu, we've also experienced 7 tropical cyclones in 4 and 5 categories over the last 5 years. There are 75 schools across Vanuatu that have been destroyed. So UNICEF is engaged in a project in Vanuatu to rebuild 23 of those schools, but the rest of them are currently unfunded in terms of rebuilding. So you have another massive disruption to education across multiple islands in Vanuatu. So let's talk about the real cost of loss and damage. The Loss and Damage Fund has not got enough financing in it. And today in Vanuatu, who is bearing the cost of loss and damage? It is people bearing the cost of loss and damage. It is the people living in climate vulnerable countries, and some of those people are children whose education is being interrupted through no fault of their own, right? Vanuatu emits almost no carbon emissions, and this is what we're in this space talking about, and yet people themselves will wear the costs of those climate impacts across generations. You cannot make up for that loss of education, right? It is a gulf. So what we're seeing now in Vanuatu is that literacy rates across generations are declining for the first time in 40 years. Okay? You cannot damage infrastructure on that kind of scale and not have impacts on children.
That's very true. Sorry. Just managing some tech problems here. Thanks, Siobhan. I think that's really powerful, and to really bring the people focus and to think about how can we actually use some of these mechanisms to look at potential solutions or change. This year, the ICJ handed down a decision which is extremely significant in terms of articulating obligations for countries to take action on climate change. I'm interested to get your take on how a legal finding like this one can strengthen the mechanisms that we have to protect children and other groups, and how you see it being used in practice as we go forward.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll answer this question and then I'll just offer my apology because I actually have to leave and go to the presidency consultations on the NDC because it's an agenda item I helped write for AOSIS. So I'm so sorry to have to leave you. I think the ICJ offers us this beacon of hope, really. The advisory opinion is something that the Pacific Students Fighting for Climate Change initiated. I was one of the lawyers and negotiators who worked on it in the early years, in particular for Vanuatu. Vanuatu spearheaded that at a state level and at an international level, and I think it's groundbreaking. So let's talk about what it says and what it means in a process like this. It talks about the mandatory obligations that states have under the Paris Agreement. It talks about the fact that states may be prosecuted for continuing to support the production of fossil fuels. It talks about the fact that states have signed up to a series of mandatory commitments in relation to the Paris Agreement, and that those mandatory commitments require of states that they create NDCs, and that those NDCs actually include domestic mitigation targets, and that the NDCs accelerate across time. Now, what that offers is a basis not just for international action to occur, for causal action to take place between one state and another. It also offers opportunities on a whole new scale for climate litigation to reference international agreement making. So we already have globally thousands of climate litigation cases. And since the ICJ-AO was handed down, they have been referencing it. And it has become increasingly recognised in various jurisdictions around the world. So globally, we have these youth movements who are asking intergenerationally to be taken into account. Bang. They're asking intergenerationally to be taken into account. They're asking, for example, that fossil fuel projects initiated by one state take into account carbon emissions globally. They're asking for environmental reparations, essentially, to be taken into account intergenerationally. That's what school strikes were about. That's what a lot of these cases internal to domestic climate litigation have been about. They're youth-led movements, often. And I think these youth-led movements are able to have renewed hope from the ICJ-AO, a movement itself that was youth-led, that was run by the Pacific, supported by states like Vanuatu. There was a moment in time where Vanuatu was the only state that supported this movement. I know because I was the negotiator at the time asking other states for support. And it takes courage, it takes radical hope in these spaces to create change. But things are possible and change will come. The question you need to ask yourself is, will the change come fast enough for the Pacific? And will the change come fast enough for climate vulnerable children in the Pacific who are already impacted today? We are already letting them down now.
Thank you, Siobhan. If we can thank Siobhan for coming, and I think that's the very nature of COP right now, is that she's off to put those words into action. I think what she said is really important, and that the fact that the ICJ case was something that was youth-led is a very powerful thing, and an opportunity for organisations like UNICEF to ask ourselves, how can we stand up as allies to young leaders who are really making change, and where are the opportunities for us to work in partnership? I want to turn to Lincoln. You're from a regional community that has been directly impacted by devastating climate disasters. The Black Summer bushfires was an entire 3+ months of devastating fires. How did you see how children and young people were affected by those fires? What supports were available to specifically target children's needs? And what did you see was missing from the response as a young person experiencing that?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you so much, Alice. And the Black Summer bushfires were on a scale we really haven't seen in before, you know, about the size of the United Kingdom happening in Australia and impacting our small community in Gippsland. The impacts to children and young people were really significant, from health impacts and the way smoke moved across the region. Already where I grew up has some of the highest asthma rates in the country because of the burning of brown coal. So when we add up the movement of smoke and how that impacts young lungs, we start to see that then and right through life and as people age on. Social isolation was a really big issue we saw, and that was compounded by the COVID-19 pandemic. Due to missing school, but also having to move because homes were destroyed and having to start again, and families being put under enormous amounts of strain already, social isolation became a really, really big problem in our region that we tried to deal with. In terms of the supports that were targeting children and young people, there really weren't any. They were really on the ground and in community, but government wasn't really there in a targeted way for young people. There's the traditional disaster responses, and they existed and were there for families, but wasn't there for young people. So the community responded ourselves. We targeted government grants and funding that were not youth specific and made them youth specific. So we were able to get around $2 million to deliver programs targeting bushfire recovery specifically for young people, and specifically around connection, getting back into school and bridging that disengagement gap, which has a huge contribution to future success. We know that when you disengage from school, it impacts your future income. So really trying to, already in a disadvantaged region, combat that. What was also missing, really those supports for young people immediately post-disaster, in disaster centres, making sure there's counselling, making sure there's psychological support. We know that the mental health impacts from climate disasters are really significant, hundreds of millions of dollars a year already, and that's only compounding. So that's something definitely calling for as disasters become more frequent across the globe, but particularly in regional Australian communities, particularly for First Nation communities and the cultural impacts as well. We really need to make sure that in those disaster centres and in those areas as we're going into the early stages of recovery, there's key specialists there to support young people.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that piece around making sure you're targeting the support for the people that you're working with. Is it very young children that need specialised mental health support in a different way to young people, to adults? For Indigenous communities, what are the culturally appropriate supports that are available to them? How are we adapting the response to make sure that it meets the needs of the communities impacted, I think is really critical. Jenny, you've also seen firsthand the impact that climate change is having on children in Fiji. What are some of the biggest challenges you're seeing children and young people facing, and what kind of solutions are starting to emerge that are specifically targeting their needs?
Thank you for the question. Before I start, I'll just like to thank the organization for giving me the opportunity to be part of this panel. And so I am from Fiji, and I live in the capital, that is Suva. That is more like in the urban area. While I may not like face the consequences of climate change in the urban area, but we do. It's not like it's not the same as the youths that face the consequences in the interior and youths living in the coastal area. And in urban area, like people, youths living in the low-lying area usually face the consequences of flooding, and just because of that, families have to evacuate to schools and use schools as a evacuation center because at the moment Fiji doesn't have enough evacuation center, so we use schools as the evacuation center at the moment. Let me see if I haven't missed anything else. And as a youth, as a young person from Fiji, I can see how climate change is reshaping childhood. When cyclones or floods hit, schools get damaged, like I said. School supplies are destroyed, and families are forced to move into evacuation centers. Year after year, children miss school just because of the schools are being used as an evacuation center. Their curriculums are being, the schools are missed. So that is one of the challenges youths in Fiji face. The other one is infrastructure, is another issue. Um, During cyclones and hurricanes, bridges are washed away, and due to the rising water levels, it makes it dangerous, like for youths to cross the road to go to school and even to come back. There are real case scenarios where there are real cases where children have no choice but to swim across, like walk across flooded areas just to get home and even to school. And it is heartbreaking to hear from the youths that like they're after school they're tired and they're hungry, but then they have to like go home somehow, so they have no other option but to like cross the flooded river. And just because of that, the other issue is mental health, like my colleague mentioned. Mental health is another major issue as well in the Pacific. This is something we don't talk about much in the Pacific because sometimes youths are really afraid to come out and tell them how they are feeling, just because they think they are going to be judged. And yeah, um, and when I was a kid, I often heard cyclone warnings and or that we need to go to the upper area so we can be safe and all. And I had cousins coming over to my place because they were living in the low-lying area. It was so sad because they used to come home, and then after everything was settled and everything was done, they used to go back home, and then like their houses were damaged, their crops were damaged. So there is another challenge, damage of crops, because that is one of the source of incomes in Fiji communities rely on. And um, but despite all of these challenges, I want to highlight something important. Being a small island developing state that faces a lot of consequences from climate impacts of climate change, young people in Pacific are incredibly resilient. After a major event happens, we get up the next day and we start rebuilding. We take up leading initiatives such as mangrove planting and restoration, ocean cleanups, awareness campaigns, and community-led initiatives. They, they are the youths in the Pacific are active, they're informed, and they're ready to be part of the solution. And we are also beginning to see better disaster drills in schools, and we are having more conversations about mental health and climate change in schools, because it's really important for the youths in the Pacific to know and understand uh, if we don't do anything right now, they are the ones who are going to face the consequences in the future. So the decision we make today, it's gonna affect them in the future. So that is one thing. And yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, it's such an important point, particularly when we think about mental health. It's such a hard thing to measure, and we'll get a little bit later into how UNICEF Australia started to measure things like mental health and the impact of that. And one of the things we're hearing is, you know, we know anecdotally, and maybe we have some small targeted evidence on the types of impacts that climate change is having on children. You know, we know in an individual disaster, perhaps how many schools are closed, or, you know, particular damage to infrastructure. But what is largely lacking is a comprehensive picture of risk and hazard that can allow governments, that can allow communities to make better decisions and to plan in order to build the resilience to future risks and hazards. So, Sylvia, can you tell us a little bit about how UNICEF's been working to map in detail the climate hazards and vulnerabilities that children face, to help develop this picture that can, you know, go from the very local all the way to the global level, and the next steps in this work and kind of what UNICEF's hoping to achieve with that?
Thanks. And let me start by saying that our senior expert and chief of data and analytics for climate is in this room, is there at the end of the room. So if you have a question of the database, hazard database, or how this index was built, please ask him, because he's our expert. This is a UNICEF-led initiative, because as we went into understanding the impacts of climate change in children, we realized that we needed to have more information in order to be able to inform better policies, better action, and better financing for the activities. And I will put some examples, but let me say that this global child hazard database it's the second version that we are producing now. The first report was launched like around 5 years ago, and now we are upgrading a much more sophisticated and technical way to look at how children experience different hazards, how they are exposed, and which are the different levels of vulnerability. Because this is a little bit the secret to understand how to react to this, right? For instance, you may have a place where the hazards are very high. And we have seen this, for instance, in the last typhoons that we have seen, right? There have been typhoons that have hit Central America, Jamaica, and typhoon that has hit Philippines, right? In a space of 1 or 2 weeks. And you have seen that the effects have been different. Probably the hazard was a little bit different, but they were pretty intense, both of them. But the effect on communities, on the environment, on children, has been different because the exposure and the vulnerability has changed. So we need to understand how all this is put at play using the most advanced techniques and information, and do a different kind of data sets and data kind of cuts to inform this decision making. Particularly because we want to assure that there are measures and programs that are designed in a way that can protect children from these hazards, from their exposure, and from the vulnerability. And this is not only at a programmatic level, let's say community intervention, it's also at policy level. And it's also at climate financing level. For instance, in terms of policy level, our colleague was explaining how the cyclones are impacting Vanuatu, and we have seen that last year 2 or 3 cyclones come into the difference of days and blow up entire schools. And this has a huge impact, because the way to rebuild the schools will take years for these communities, and then the children are out of school, simply explained. So how we can help governments to put different standards for constructing schools that are resilient to these shocks. Maybe they won't be resilient to the super typhoon or super cyclone, but on average of the cyclones, we can have schools that are designed in a way that can be resilient. For instance, we know that the babies are very much affected by the heat waves, because their bodies cannot absorb the difference of temperature as we absorb it, because we have a bigger body, right? But yet, all the newborn areas in hospitals are always, in the tropical zone, are always in the top floor, which is the hottest floor. So why we don't change simply the policy? We don't even need money to change this policy, but we need to change policy. So this is to say that the actions are at different levels. Policy, and then I say, of course, we need to build resilient services for children. I put the example of the schools. The same happens with the healthcare facilities. They need to be resilient. They need to be connected with renewable energy because this is much more sustainable. And at the time that they are hit by a cyclone, the energy of the healthcare facility is not disturbed because there is a shortage of fuel or whatever, and then all the services are disrupted, the vaccines are completely damaged, and we cannot keep on the vaccination, right? We need to intervene in nutrition. We need to intervene in child protection. Nutrition is important because, of course, due to the loss of the livelihoods of the families, then children get into the malnutrition, and then this is something that will affect their intellectual capacity forever if they have suffered this when they were in the first 1,000 days. Child protection, you mentioned the relocation of communities, right? And this is also something that the UNICEF is supporting government of Fiji in the relocation process, because we need to assure that this relocation, new sites are child-friendly and protect children from any kind of abuse or any kind of problem, right? So this is to say that the programs that UNICEF designs together with the different sector partners are really specifically providing answers to specific needs from children and the communities and the services they rely on. And definitely also, it's important the aspect of climate financing, because the finance is not enough for adaptation, but when we look at children-specific interventions for climate, is only the 2.4% of the climate finance that really reach children. So UNICEF is really making the case that we need to allocate more resources for adaptation, because even if we stop the emissions today and we go to zero emissions, climate change will be felt in the next 50 or 75 years. So we need to really build resilience while we also reduce the emissions, of course, which is the only long-term solution. But in the meantime, in the present, we need to have programs and climate finance that goes into programs that are covering specific needs for children, and some of the ones that I mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvia. And if I'm right, the Global Child Hazard Database will be publicly available fairly soon. And it really paints a picture of these overlapping hazards. Which communities in a country are facing heat? Which communities are facing, coastal erosion? What types of disasters and hazards are facing communities? And then what kind of services and resilience factors are at play? So you can really get a picture quite quickly and quite visually to say, here are the communities that are at most at risk. Here are the types of interventions that are going to really have the most effect and really target and prioritize some of those policy and funding decisions.
Maybe let me add that exactly as Alice was saying, the database will be able to help also to prioritize action, because we cannot have action all over the place at a single moment, right? We need to prioritize where the most vulnerable are. And the fact that we are able to build these multiple overlapping and combine it with the vulnerability levels, it gives us the red zones, right? We know that on average 1 billion children are at very high risk of climate events. But if we need to choose tomorrow, with the money that we will have available, where to intervene, this database will show us the hot spots, and then of course will indicate and help us on the better planning, and as explained before.
Absolutely. Which takes us quite nicely actually to Lincoln. At the moment, children and young people's needs are not explicitly taken into account in disaster preparedness and response in Australia. But I'd be interested to hear, can you explain to us a bit about the work that Australia has been doing with Deloitte Access Economics to really measure and cost out the impacts of disasters on children and young people, and what we've found through the research? What does it tell us about how we can adjust our policy to have better impact?
Absolutely. Thanks, Alice. And this report was really validating for me to read, because it really put into context the cost to children and young people in Australia when they experience a disaster. More broadly, it shows the cost to government. And it also shows the cost of inaction and how important mitigation is. If we don't, currently we're sitting at about $6.3 billion a year for Australian governments to deal with disasters on the impacts of children and young people. If we don't stick to 1.5, that could be upwards of $12.1 billion every single year by 2060. So very clearly, we're being told here and can see the dollar value each and every year that this is going to cost us if we don't try and target 1.5, if we don't commit to mitigation. But we also see the really critical issues and health issues and other areas that climate is starting to infiltrate. Over $190 million a year in child abuse increased costs because of disasters across Australia. This report really goes to show what inaction is, the costs of inaction, and it also shows the human stories as well and really shows the different issues they impact. We were talking about mental health before. That's $662 million a year already that it's costing Australian governments. It costs governments also disproportionately. Queensland is looking at up to $40 billion in increased costs to support children and young people in and post-disaster. In Victoria, where I'm from, that's about $17 billion. These are governments that are already very stressed in their budgets and their financial situation. They're not planning for these situations, but this report tells us that lack of action is going to continue to cost us more. So it is an alarm bell, and it's also validating the stories of young people right across Australia. And I think it's a moment for a bit of reflection and really start to look at how can we be more child and youth-centric in disaster policy and recovery. And I think that's where some of the recommendations here really go towards walking that and having a national framework for children and young people, making sure that our disaster responses are really youth and child-centric, right from in our centres all the way up to mitigation policy.
Absolutely, and I think that it really tells the story of how having evidence can start to shape the message that we give, the stories that we tell, and influence policymakers from a different lens. You know, often we talk about the kind of rights-based imperative to focus on the needs of children and young people, and that still stands. You know, those rights are critical to why we're here and what we do, but having the costing to really show this is where your investment can have the best impact on the economy, that can also benefit the rights of children in a positive way, I think really starts to paint a more holistic picture of what we can do and why. Thanks, Lincoln. And then if we look at climate finance and we look at how money is being invested, we know that in the Pacific there's a range of complex barriers in how Pacific nations can access climate finance. Jenny, can you tell us some of the key challenges and specifically what are some of the changes you'd like to see in climate finance architecture to help children and young people benefit from some of the climate finance that's coming through?
Of course. Thank you. Thank you for the question. From where we stand as youth, climate finance feels distant and complicated, as we all know. We know the money exists, but getting it across to those who need it, especially children, is difficult. One big issue is the accessibility of fund. Different funders have different criteria that needs to be met, and we all know how complicated it can all get in order to get it approved. There is also timing issue as well. Youth and children, they can't wait for 5 years for a fund to get approved, right? Their needs are immediate. Their education, their safety, their health. So to change that, we need climate finance that is simpler, faster, and fit for purpose. We need dedicated funding windows for small island states. Second, support for child-focused programs. Third, direct access for community-based and youth-led groups. It's about time that youth are included during the decision-making process because we are the present and we will be the future as well. And we also want to be part of designing the solutions and not just be the beneficiaries. Thank you.
Absolutely. And we see some of the amazing work that youth-led organisations are doing, and yet how complex it is for those groups to access finance.
all communities
to kind of meet the requirements of those big financing bodies can be really complex. We're coming to the end of our panel, and we'll finish with a video. But first of all, Sylvia, I would like to invite you to give us some closing words on why it's so essential to invest in children when we're looking at climate resilience, and why is this something that, we've heard that only 2.4% of global climate finance is targeted towards children currently. Why is it so essential that we change that stat?
Hi, yes. Well, there is, of course, a moral argument, right, for intervention, because children cannot be left behind. Children and youth cannot be left behind. There is a very straightforward moral argument that, the humanity needs to really act and deliver on the special needs that children, as a very vulnerable group, have facing climate hazards and climate shocks. There is also another argument, which is what you just said, that children and youth are asking this to us. And we are the leaders for today, they will be the leaders for the future. And they are asking us to train them, to skill them, to inform them, to prepare them, to invest on them so that they can really find solutions that we have failed to find. We have failed to the new generations to really find the good solutions for the climate problem. So we need to actually invest, because this is what it will help in building their futures. Children are the ones most exposed to the floods and to the droughts and to all the climate hazards. And of course, as I said, we need to act on that. There is also the argument that you really brought into the explanation. Is not only a moral argument, there is an economic argument. It's more cheap to invest today in building resilience than respond and rebuild all the things that will be destroyed in the next shock. Because the shocks, whether we like it or not, are going to increase. The hazards are going to be harder and harder on us and on the most vulnerable communities. So rather than wait and then reconstruct, let's invest now, because we have the numbers and we have a very strong economic case to build on that. And actually, because the world, in places like this at COP, have taken decisions, right? There was a very clear target for mitigation. And 2 years ago, it was adopted the global goal on adaptation. Everything that we do to build resilience will build in towards global goal on adaptation. And we cannot claim as a world seriously that we are building resilience if we are not investing in the most vulnerable groups, in the places that are most hit, most impacted, and with the solutions that they need to really be able to absorb the future shocks, because we know that they are happening. So if we really want to claim that we are helping and based on the global achievement, on the global adaptation, that we are contributing towards this, there is no other choice that invest on social services that are really at the basis of the communities, because children and their families rely on this, and this is the initial basis for resilience building and for adaptation. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvia. Such a powerful case. We've heard so many examples today about why it's so important to put children on the agenda. I want to thank Australia for letting us host this conversation and really put children on the agenda today. I think it's so important that we don't just assume that children are little adults, and if we design interventions that will reach adults, the children will automatically benefit. We have so much evidence to prove that that isn't the case. There are unique needs. There's also unique leadership. There's also unique ways in which children are standing up and taking action. It's such an important thing for us to focus on, and happy to continue the conversation if anybody wants to talk about how we can build a better evidence base for this. Could you please thank our panelists today for sharing with you their thoughts? Jenny's got one final.
Hi. Sorry, just a quick one. I've seen a lot of youths here in the audience. I just want to say one thing to the youths here in the pavilion and even out there. I know some of you work for the government, NGOs, and other sectors as well. And sometimes you are pushed in meetings or even forums where you're the youngest one in the room. And sometimes it can be intimidating. You can feel overwhelmed. But please, speaking from experience, I don't like giving advice to people, but one thing I will tell you, if you have any questions, any queries, or any doubt, please raise it. Because you never know whatever you're thinking, and if someone else bring it up and you're like, oh, right, I was thinking about that, I should have said that. That happened to me a lot of times. I kept on thinking something, and then I was like, oh, I should have said it. But then like some other person said it. I'm like, oh, so, because every time I have a fear that, oh, what if my questions are silly? But no questions is silly. Please feel free to answer. Question like your supervisors or superiors, or even in the meeting, please do that. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Jenny. I think it leads us very nicely. We did want to share with you one final small video, which is to acknowledge that it's not just adults who are taking action, that young people are taking action in many ways. Young people are raising voices and showing leadership. So here's a short video about some of the ways that young people across Australia and the Pacific are doing this and how privileged we are to work alongside them.